1840 hold that single year in your mind, not a span of time, not an epoch, just one specific date. 3 expeditions, American, British, French, each sailing independently to the same frozen continent, Antarctica, within months of each other. For years, I accepted that. Parallel exploration during the age of discovery seems reasonable enough on the surface. Then I came across a single line buried in a footnote of Wilkes's suppressed expedition log, a line his superiors cut from the published version. 7 words, formations inconsistent with any natural process known. 50 years later, a survivor from the first team to winter over in Antarctica, led by a Norwegian-British explorer named Borchgrevink, gave one interview describing his crew seeing cities beneath the ice. That passage wasn't translated into English for 6 decades. That's when I could no longer look away. Let's establish what we know, what the textbooks say, what the official record permits. Charles Wilkes, American naval officer, departed in August 1838 commanding 6 vessels. He mapped over 1,500 miles of Antarctic coastline and returned in 1842. His filed report was contested almost immediately, not for being too audacious, but for being incomplete. His charts included features and formations his own officers noted discrepancies between the official log and what crew members described in private correspondence later uncovered by researchers. Wilkes faced court-martial upon returning. Not once, but multiple times over his career. Accused of illegally punishing his crew, of conduct unbecoming. He was acquitted on most charges. Yet he spent decades buried in bureaucratic obscurity, his Antarctic findings sidelined, his personal journals heavily edited before publication. Dumont d'Urville departed Toulon in September 1837. His mission, push farther south than any French vessel, claim territory, advance science, plant the tricolor in the ice. He returned in November 1840. He published his accounts. Adélie Land, named for his wife, was charted. He is remembered, celebrated. In May 1842, he boarded a train at Versailles with his wife and son. The train derailed. The fire that followed was catastrophic. D'Urville, his wife, his son, none survived. Much of the material he'd been carrying, including expedition documents reportedly being transported for review, vanished. Not lost at sea, not destroyed in a naval warehouse fire, on a train in France, 2 years after returning from Antarctica. I'm not claiming that means something. I want to be precise, train accidents happen. Tragedy is not conspiracy. But hold that detail. Just hold it. And James Clark Ross, the most decorated of the 3. He reached what would be named the Ross Ice Shelf, a wall of ice as high as the White Cliffs of Dover, stretching hundreds of miles. He described it as impenetrable, staggering, something that stopped him absolutely. His published accounts are models of Victorian scientific restraint, precise, methodical, dispassionate. Yet his crew logs, the raw ones filed with the Admiralty, taking researchers decades to fully access, contain passages nowhere in the official narrative. References to what one officer called geometric anomalies in the exposed rock faces. References in at least 2 independent crew journals to what sounds like structured stone, not ice, stone. If you follow the thread further, and once you start, it's genuinely difficult to stop, you arrive at Karsten Borchgrevink, Norwegian-British explorer. He was part of a whaling expedition in 1895 that became, by most accounts, the first group to actually land on the Antarctic continent. Not just chart from offshore, not just approach and retreat, land, stand, walk. He returned in 1898 with a dedicated scientific expedition, the Southern Cross Expedition, and spent the winter of 1899 on the continent. The first humans to deliberately overwinter in Antarctica. What did he find? Here the official record does something I've come to recognize. It narrows. It becomes very specific about certain things, the cold, the isolation, biological samples, meteorological measurements, and very vague, almost deliberately vague, about others. One of his crew, a zoologist named Nikolai Hansen, died during the expedition. Official cause, a digestive condition. He was 29. Buried on a ridge overlooking the bay. His death gets 1 paragraph in most historical accounts. Another crew member returned and spent the rest of his life declining to speak publicly about what he'd experienced. He gave one interview, to a Norwegian newspaper in 1903. The relevant section wasn't translated into English for nearly 60 years. When it finally was, it described crew members experiencing what the interviewer gently called episodes of geographic fixation, crew members convinced they could see something beneath the ice, something organized, something that shouldn't be there. The deeper you go into Borchgrevink's own writings, the more you notice a pattern in his language. Precise about logistics. Detailed about wildlife. Strangely abstract, almost poetic, almost evasive, when describing interior geology, when describing what the rock looked like where wind had scoured the ice away. When describing what the formations reminded him of, he never finishes those sentences. Not once, not metaphorically. Literally, in at least 3 known passages from his private correspondence, the sentence describing the rock formations is either cut short, abruptly shifts to another subject, or exists in a version markedly different from what was filed with his expedition sponsors. If you're finding this investigation useful, if these patterns raise questions you haven't seen elsewhere, consider sharing this work. The deeper this scrutiny reaches, the harder it becomes to ignore. Let's talk about what the physical record actually suggests. Antarctica is not uniformly covered in ice, well established. There are exposed rock regions, nunataks, where geology is accessible, where you can examine the actual surface, where under the right wind and drift conditions you can see what lies beneath the ice sheet at the margins. Early expedition members repeatedly described formations in these exposed zones that struck them as anomalous. The language varies: peculiar regularity, unusual right-angle faces, stone arrangements unlike natural weathering patterns, but the theme repeats with unsettling precision across multiple independent accounts from multiple expeditions spanning decades. Regular angles. Repeated geometric intervals. Stone that, in the words of one crew member whose journal was privately published by his family in 1931, never incorporated into mainstream historical literature, did not break the way stone breaks. Now, geologists will tell you about columnar basalt. Frost wedging, differential erosion, the natural tendency of certain volcanic rock to cleave in angular patterns. I know that. I've read those explanations. And to be fair, they account for much of what early explorers may have found disorienting in an environment unlike anything they'd seen. But here is where the orthodox explanation becomes harder to sustain. It's not the angles. It's the distribution. Multiple crew members from multiple expeditions, men who never met, in some cases citizens of actively competing nations, with no mechanism to coordinate their accounts, described similar formations in different geographic locations along the Antarctic coast. Not the same location, locations separated by hundreds of miles. If it's natural geology, columnar basalt, frost fracture, erosion, then that's interesting but unremarkable. Antarctic geology is relatively uniform in places. Fine. But overlay the approximate locations from these various accounts, and a pattern emerges that doesn't map neatly onto known geological formations. The descriptions cluster in ways that suggest, and I want to be careful here, I want to use the word suggest, distribution, intentional placement, spacing. Not a quarry. Not a single building. Something larger. Something requiring you to step back very, very far to perceive as a whole. And here is where this becomes genuinely impossible to brush aside. For the official history to hold, the natural geology plus overexcited explorer's explanation, you need to explain something. You need to explain why 3 separate governments in the same decade, with no coordinated communication, all chose to heavily redact, delay, dispute, or simply never fully publish the raw reports from their Antarctic expeditions. The United States didn't publish Wilkes's complete charts for years, some were reclassified. The British Admiralty received Ross's full logs, and a substantial portion of what his officers separately filed wasn't publicly catalogued until the 20th century. France published D'Urville's account, but that account has been noted by at least 2 French historians as diverging from surviving crew diaries in specific recurring ways, always the same kind of divergence: the geological observations, the descriptions of the coastline's interior features, the character of the exposed rock. Not the temperature readings, not the biological specimens, not the navigational data. The rocks. Why the rocks? 3 nations, no shared communication, all suppressing the same category of information. The official explanation doesn't just strain here, it collapses entirely. For this to be coincidence, you'd need to believe that 3 separate governments operating in competitive isolation all independently decided that Antarctica's geological features were too sensitive to publish accurately, for reasons none of them ever formally articulated, within the same 20-year window. Or something else, something they all saw, or were told about, that required the same response. Here I have to be honest about the limits of what I can demonstrate versus what I can only gesture toward. There is a body of research, not fringe, not anonymous internet speculation, but work by architectural historians, geographers, scholars of cartographic anomalies, quietly building a case for a prior world-spanning civilization whose reach was substantially broader and whose erasure was substantially more deliberate than mainstream history acknowledges. You'll have encountered this material under various names. The maps produced before formal exploration, the Piri-Reis map, the Orontius-Phineas map, appearing to depict Antarctic coastlines with a specificity that shouldn't have been possible. Coastlines matching subice topography only confirmed by 20th century sonar. Coastlines depicted without the ice that now covers them. How? The standard answer: these maps were copied from older sources, possibly compiled from explorers whose records are now lost, is itself an admission. It admits cartographic knowledge of Antarctica before the expeditions we recognize as first contact. It admits that someone had been there, mapped it, left records detailed enough that 16th century European cartographers could reproduce them with recognizable accuracy. It just doesn't ask who. And here is where the thread from 1840 connects to something much larger. If there existed, at some point prior to recorded history, or prior to the history we're permitted to access, a civilization operating at a scale capable of worldwide presence, construction in extreme environments, leaving traces in rock still visible to 19th century naval officers even through accumulated centuries of ice and weathering, then the question isn't whether Antarctica was inhabited. The question is when it stopped being inhabited. And after that, why the record of its habitation was so thoroughly, so consistently, so globally erased. Not suppressed in one country. Not buried by one government. Erased across languages, across archives, across the official histories of nations that have spent centuries in competition, and yet somehow arrived at the same silence on this single subject. That uniformity of silence is itself a form of evidence. I want to return to the human element for a moment, because this isn't just an archival mystery. It's a story about what these expeditions did to the men on them. The rate of psychological distress among early Antarctic expedition crews isn't widely discussed in mainstream historical literature, but it's documented. Multiple crew members from the Wilkes expedition were described in ship records as suffering from what the surgeons of the day called polar madness, a broad diagnosis covering everything from simple cabin fever to episodes of acute hallucinatory crisis. Some of these men described visions, cities, architecture in the ice. Now I know the rational response. Isolation, hypoxia, the psychological strain of extreme environments, visual distortions from Antarctic light phenomena, fata morgana, the mirage effect polar explorers are well documented to have experienced, where distant ice can appear to take the shapes of towers, walls, buildings. All of that is real, documented. I'm not dismissing it. But here is what I keep returning to. The visions these crew members reported were not random. Not generic castles or European cityscapes transposed onto ice. The architectural descriptions that survived, in private letters, unpublished journals, the one or two accounts that made it into print before being quietly discontinued, have a specific character. Massive scale. Non-European proportion. Stone rather than timber or brick. Layouts suggesting not individual buildings but planned arrangements, districts, grids. And they described it as buried, visible only in fragments, as if whatever they were seeing, whether mirage or hallucination or something else entirely, was the exposed corner of something incomprehensibly larger, still concealed beneath the ice. One officer, I'll decline to name him, as his family is still identifiable, wrote to his brother that he had seen from the ship's deck a sequence of walls extending along the cliff face for a distance I cannot estimate, bearing no resemblance to any formation I was able to attribute to nature or weather. He wrote that he reported it to his commanding officer. He wrote that he was told to strike it from his personal log. He wrote that he did not strike it from the letter. That letter was donated to a regional archive by his descendants in 1974. It has been cited in exactly one academic paper, never republished after its initial appearance in a specialist journal that folded 2 years later. What strikes me, the longer I sit with this material, isn't the individual anomalies. Any single one could be explained. Any individual discrepancy, any single redaction, any one explorer's breakdown or unexplained death or cryptic letter taken alone, each is manageable. Historical noise. It's the pattern. Not the geology alone. Not the simultaneous expeditions alone. Not the suppressed reports alone. Not the deaths alone. Not the raving crew members alone. Not the pre-ice maps alone. All of it together, pointing in the same direction across a century of Antarctic engagement, across governments that despised each other, across languages and archives and institutional interests that had every reason to compete and no apparent reason to cooperate, and yet cooperating, or at least converging on a single uniform absence. The question isn't who made the decision. Maybe no single person did. Maybe the decision made itself, the way certain truths, if large enough and disruptive enough, generate their own institutional gravity toward erasure. Not conspiracy in the movie sense. Something slower, more diffuse. Something operating through the ordinary human instinct to protect the version of history that allows everything else to continue functioning. Because if what these expedition members saw was real, if the formations were architectural, if the scale matched the descriptions, if the geographic distribution maps onto something intentional, then the implications don't stop at Antarctica. They ripple backward through everything. Every timeline. Every assumption about the age, origin, and reach of human civilization. Every map. Every founding myth of every nation that sent ships to that ice. Once you allow that possibility in, even as a question, even as a hypothesis held lightly and provisionally, once you see the shape of what the evidence suggests, you understand why the silence is so total, so coordinated, so old. 3 expeditions. 1 silence. What did they find on that coastline that required 3 competing nations to independently arrive at the same omission? What did the rock look like in those scoured margins where wind had pulled the ice away, that made experienced naval officers reach for language they couldn't quite complete? Why do the pre-colonial maps know what they shouldn't know? Why did the men who saw it most closely come back changed, some broken, some silent, some dead before they could be properly questioned? What is the relationship between those geometric distributions and the ones researchers have been quietly documenting in dozens of other locations across the Earth? The architectural uniformities, the impossible coordination, the civilization scale evidence appearing wherever someone looks carefully enough and is willing to write down what they actually see, rather than what they've been told to see. I don't know. Genuinely. And I want to be careful not to claim more than the evidence supports. But I know what the evidence suggests. I know what it feels like to read these accounts in sequence, to watch the same absence repeat across decades, across languages, across the institutional memories of governments that should have no reason to agree on anything. It feels like a door someone very carefully closed. And somewhere on the other side of it, under ice that has been thickening for centuries, over stone that may or may not have been shaped by hands we have no name for, the answer is still there. Waiting for whoever is willing to ask the question loudly enough.